and get you into our first conversation tonight, because in Zimbabwe, basic commodities have been disappearing off the shelves. Protests were planned for Wednesday and Thursday against a 2% tax on electronic transactions. But trade union leaders were arrested ahead of the nationwide strikes. The country is in a panic tonight. So we ask, when will those arrested be released, and what is the government doing to combat the drop in the currency? Joining me to unpack all of this is human rights lawyer Nqobizitha, Mlilo, and Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition's Blessing Vava. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you both, and thank you for coming in. I think the one question as we approach the one-year anniversary of the removal of the longtime leader, Robert Mugabe, is, has life in Zimbabwe got worse in the Emmerson Mnangagwa era? Nqobizitha, your first take.
I think nothing has changed, and I think even during the coup itself, some of us did indicate that the coup was only a precursor to, one, a maintenance of the status quo, or secondly, a continuous perpetuation of the same. And with Emmerson Mnangagwa coming, he hoped that the elections would give him the legitimacy that he needed, and therefore use that legitimacy to re-engage with the international community and revive the economy. The EU report that was released today has basically put the final nail on the coffin of his illegitimacy. So the fact that he will not be able to get the legitimacy that he requires, of necessity, means that the economy will not be able to perform well. So it's going to be worse in the days to come.
Blessing, it's one thing to read the reports about the situation in Zimbabwe, but give us an idea of just how widespread the crisis is. Is this across the urban areas all the way to the rural areas, or are we seeing a greater impact in a specific part of Zimbabwe?
I think what's happening in Zimbabwe is a real crisis. It's a national crisis. It's not just a crisis that is confined to the urban areas. Because you should understand that there is a link between the urban and the rural. You can't separate the two. But what is happening, it's quite sad in that many Zimbabweans were optimistic about Emmerson Mnangagwa coming in. I was not, because first of all, he came through a military coup. Secondly, he rigged elections in July. And thirdly, his economic template that is proffering is a neoliberal template that is anti-poor, that is anti the people of Zimbabwe. And we know for a fact that the trajectory that Zimbabwe is traveling in has been traveled before. You know of the ESAP of 1992. You know of the time of Gideon Gono, when the government embarked on neoliberal economic policies. But what they only did was to continue hating the ordinary Zimbabweans.
And just on that point that you made about President Emmerson Mnangagwa rigging elections, just to be clear, at a legal level, the courts in the country have found that he did not rig the elections, which is how he was now eventually inaugurated. Let's just clear that up. But Nqobizitha, at a more real level, how is the ordinary Zimbabwean then getting by in these difficult times?
Tembekile, you're never going to be able to understand and discuss Zimbabwe properly unless you locate the source of the problem. What Vava is talking to is the central reason why Zimbabwe is what it is. It is the very reason we're having this discussion after all.
Which is what?
That the elections were rigged. That the mere fact that you go through some facade of a court process and a judgment is given, which judgment is unsound legally. And for that matter, as we speak now, we have been promised a fully reasoned legal judgment that justifies the decision of the Constitutional Court. How many weeks has it been that judgment has not been there? So we should not create the facade, because in Zim they've created a constitutionalized dictatorship, which is given a veneer of legitimacy by following some form of a liberal process that seems to suggest that because you went to court, and therefore that suggests that the elections were not rigged. As we speak now, we don't know by what margin of vote Mnangagwa won, because even the Constitutional Court itself couldn't locate the exact figures. So unless you locate the problem exactly where Vava has located it, that the legitimacy of Mnangagwa cannot be justified, precisely because even the court today cannot tell us by how many votes Mnangagwa won. So you cannot resolve the economic problem that we are talking about now unless you resolve the legitimacy question in Zimbabwe. Because as it is now, the opposition is talking about preparing for protests to confront the state. Which investor is going to come into the country under a cloud in which the incumbent is threatened with resistance by his own people, in which the incumbent is rejected in all urban areas, which is the source of tax. So you cannot talk about Zimbabwe unless you accept the reality that elections in Zimbabwe are an unnecessary inconvenience of a regime that is not interested in democracy.
But the pushback to that, Nqobizitha, is that people will say that what we are dealing with here are activists and an opposition that is simply unwilling to accept a result against it, and that just because you disagree with an outcome doesn't necessarily make it illegitimate or wrong. What do you say to that particular view?
I would say, give me an answer as to how many votes Mnangagwa won by. Because the results that were announced by ZAC are different to the results that they defended in court. So which result is it? That confirms the legitimacy of Mnangagwa as a legitimate president in the country. So we have an election in which we don't know how many votes Mnangagwa says he has. So we cannot resolve the Zimbabwean question unless you are able to resolve the legitimacy question around the presidency of Mr. Mnangagwa. The mere fact that you control guns and the coercive arms of the state does not make you legitimate. In fact, it makes you the enemy of the Zimbabwean people who demand a legitimate government that is consequent to an election, that is consequent to the respect of their will as expressed at the ballot box. So the simple answer would be, we don't know which number of votes Mnangagwa is said to be the president in the country.
So you're pointing to a discrepancy in the numbers filed in the court papers and what was released by the Electoral Commission, but Blessing, the question then becomes, the highest court in Zimbabwe, the Constitutional Court, has now ruled on this. And if there is still this much dissatisfaction with the election outcome, what then is the solution for Zimbabwe?
I think first and foremost, Zimbabwe's constitution is not a good constitution. You know that it was a product of the political parties that were part of the government of national unity. And that constitution is its flaws. Some of us, we campaigned against it simply because it gave enormous powers to the president. You know, the president is the sole prerogative to appoint all the judges of the Constitutional Court, including the Chief Justice. So the judgment therein that, came out, it was a facade. We must not try to apply lipstick on a frog. The situation in Zimbabwe is very deplorable, and the EU report that came out yesterday, it condemned those elections. I was an observer. I saw what happened. I was on the ground. But going forward, I think the situation that should happen now, going forward, I think first and foremost, we need to return to legitimacy. What do I mean with that? Zimbabwe is currently under military rule, but with the face of a civilian of Emmerson Mnangagwa. And secondly, we need the regional bodies, especially SADC, as the guarantors of the elections, of the election that happened in the region, to make sure that they bring all the parties on board and find a solution. There has to be a dialogue in Zimbabwe, because if the situation is left to what it is now, it has a potential of degenerating, and it cannot only happen in Zimbabwe, it can spread to the other countries in the region.
Right, at the top of the hour, we did invite your calls if you are listening into this conversation, and I understand Casper is on the line from Bloemfontein. And Casper, you want the government in Zimbabwe to account?
Yes, my point is very simple. The argument about elections is not an issue, because elections are past, they have come and they've gone. We are not interested in politicking, we are interested in building our country. We have a president who has been elected. There is no perfect democracy in the world. That we must understand and live with. Now, what the government must do is learn to account. The recent electronic transaction tax that they put in, they should have been able to say, in the past, government has borrowed money internally, that is the domestic debt and the external debt. This is what the money was used for. And these are the things that we have done in the past that we are not going to do from now onwards. That's why people are protesting, because they are not happy with the way government has accounted for funds in the past. They have failed to account for revenue generated from the diamonds and all the other issues that we can raise. So we need our government to be able to say, particularly Treasury, the new finance minister must be able to say, this is what has been done in the past that we are going to stop. So as we raise the new revenue, this is how we are going to appropriate it. Mm-hmm. Unless if that happens, people are never going to be happy. trust has to be built by transparency, by a demonstration, a very clear and deliberate demonstration of how to appropriate funds transparently and how to account, how to deal with corruption and misappropriation. That's what has been happening. There's funds that have been used to buy agricultural equipment in the past. Nobody's accounted for that. That equipment is there lying idle. People are not appropriating it.
Okay.
So we need the government to account for expenditure.
Casper?
It doesn't have to be a complicated economic jargon that we need.
All right,
here.
Casper.
Simple.
We hear you, Casper, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, and we're going to continue taking more of your calls. We're just going to bring up that number that you can use to just be part of this conversation on screen right now. Nqobizitha, on the back of Casper saying there is no perfect democracy, it brings us to the other thing that people have been saying, doesn't it, about how perhaps the focus should move away from the contestation around the election outcome and now move on to the greater problems facing Zimbabwe. Do you think that is a doable thing to say, look, we were not happy with the outcome of the election, in fact we still aren't, but the health sector is a mess. There are no jobs. There is now this 2% tax on electronic transactions. Let's focus on fixing the bread and butter issues, even though there is this discontent around the outcome of that July election.
There can never be any doubt that we should always be concerned about the welfare of our people. There can never be any doubt that that is where the might of our minds must be. But we cannot create a temporary solution for a long-term problem. It is important to resolve the primary problem. The Zimbabwean economy has been on a windfall since at least 2000, precisely because the legitimacy question of the executive in particular has not been resolved. Every time we've had elections, the election results have been contested. And it is this contestation of the electoral result which has caused the economic problems that we had. In 2008, we had serious economic problems. They were resolved by some form of a government of national unity. We are back again to the same situation where the economy is crumbling again. Are we going to resolve that by creating some form of a unity government again in order to perpetuate the very same people that are causing the economic problem? So it is important that we deal with the issue of resolving the social problems that our people face. But we must never lose sight of the fact that it is important that we resolve the legitimacy question. Once you resolve the legitimacy question, Zimbabwe is inherently, and it has the inherent ingredients of a functional economy. It is quite possible to recover, for that economy to recover quite quickly.
We did invite calls, and Musa is on the line from Eswatini. And Musa, you want to speak to SADC's role in the situation in Zimbabwe?
Yes, sir. I totally agree with my two sons there. I know the human rights young lawyer. I've worked with him while I was at OSISA. But the fact is, talking about SADC has been a total failure in our region. There is absolutely nothing that we can put on SADC to assist this region go democratic, peaceful, just, and prosperous. There is nothing that's going to happen. I live in a country where we've just had a facade called elections, which SADC has called peaceful, free, and fair. And the AU and the Commonwealth says there never was any election in Swaziland. So that's a situation we have in this region.
Mm-hmm. All right, Musa, thank you. Let's leave it there. So Musa speaks about SADC's role, and I think anyone who's followed the Zimbabwe story long enough knows that there is this lack of trust among Zimbabweans about SADC and its involvement, which comes back to comments made in South Africa yesterday. Our International Relations Minister, Lindiwe Sisulu, saying that the South African government is on standby to assist Zimbabwe, but that cannot happen without a request from the Zimbabwean government for help. Do you think that's going to happen, Blessing?
Well, I think we cannot now run away from the fact that Zimbabwe is in a crisis. And that crisis is not a crisis for Zimbabweans alone. You know how these countries are interlinked. It is now the role and the duty of SADC to pay attention to what is happening in Zimbabwe. Us as an organization, as Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, we have sought audience with the chairperson of SADC, and that is going to happen in the next 2 weeks, so that we appraise him about the situation in Zimbabwe, so that they act as a matter of urgency until the situation is finally resolved. The moment that we look at Zimbabwe in isolation, I think we'll be creating a very, very big problem. You know what happened in 2008? SADC intervened in the Zimbabwean crisis. Unfortunately, I think the negotiations were not held properly. But otherwise, that was another route to, solving the crisis that was happening in Zimbabwe.
Okay, we did speak earlier to Zimbabwe's Deputy Information Minister, that's Energy Mutodi, about the situation in the country at the moment. He told our team that the economic situation in Zimbabwe is improving and or the situation at least, I was telling you about shelves that are running empty. He says that's been worked on the back of that introduction of a 2% tax on electronic transactions. Let's listen to more of what he had to say.
The economic situation has since improved after a tragedy that we experienced soon after the announcement of the mid-term monetary policy by the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. There was confusion with regards to a 2% transaction tax that was being proposed by government to be effective on all electronic transactions. And there was confusion as to whether this 2% tax applies also to fuel importers. And we realized that some fuel importers stopped importing the commodity after realizing that they would be making a loss soon after the 2% announcement. But the Reserve Bank has since rectified the situation. A $40 million facility has been availed to assist the fuel importers to import the commodity. And we are now seeing queues disappearing. We are no longer seeing the queues, they are disappearing. Commodity prices had also gone up following the fuel scarcity. When fuel goes up, when fuel becomes scarce, it goes up in terms of its price. People start selling on the black market, and there was panic buying of goods and commodities, as people speculated that there would be empty shelves. But as we are seeing, our shelves are now refilling. There are no more fuel queues, and everything is back to normal.
And very quickly, in 30 seconds each, we're almost out of time. Nqobizitha, I want you to respond to what the Deputy Minister was saying, and then Blessing, I want you to touch on this. Zimbabwe's crisis was not created overnight, and surely it would be unfair to expect it to be resolved overnight. Ponder on that. Nqobizitha, respond to the Minister, 30 seconds.
No, I think the Minister is delusional. I don't think it's worth responding to what he's saying. I mean, the situation is getting dire. And that's precisely the heartlessness of ZANU-PF that causes us concern, that how can we be led by people who clearly have no clue about how to resolve the crisis in Zimbabwe? They simply don't care about Zimbabweans.
Okay, Blessing. It was a crisis created over years. Is it not unfair to expect the Mnangagwa government to resolve it in a matter of months?
I think it's nonsensical to expect the same people that ruined the economy for the past 38 years to solve it.
All right, let's leave it there. My guests, Nqobizitha, Mlilo and Blessing Vava, speaking to us there about the situation in Zimbabwe. Up next, our creatives have been stolen from and mistreated. Now they're getting blackmailed. We speak to Malibongwe Kilo, the latest victim, next. This is Tonight with Jane Dutton.